Great. And here we are again, Pete. Wine tasting with Pete and Dave. Hey, I got some great news this week, Pete.
What news have you got?
We've got a YouTube channel.
Oh, really?
OzwineTV.
Wow. That sounds like something that is way beyond my normal ken of imagination.
Well, it just means, Pete, we've got a place to put these little audio wine tastings with all of the bottle shots. So anyone who's interested in following the wine tasting, they can do that on YouTube. And it's just very simply OzwineTV. All one word, all lowercase. And that's
excellent. Oh, very good. Okay.
So we'll get into it today, and the first wine we're trying out here is Jacob's Creek Trilogy.
Okay.
This is a bottle fermented
sparkling wine.
Sparkling wine,
Trilogy, yeah. Interesting too that just noticing how they use the three classic French grapes, if you like, or the champagne grapes, the classic champagne grapes. Pinot Meunier is not quite as well known as the others. But yeah, the three champagne grapes, or the three grapes which are permitted in premium champagne making, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay and Pinot Meunier. And they use all three of them in a wine that's actually cheap and cheerful and really affordable. So it's interesting that they've gone to that amount of trouble to source really good grapes and to use the champagne grapes to make something which is really an everyday drink, but it sort of, I think, fights a little bit above its weight.
Cheap and cheerful, but it tastes nice.
But yeah, exactly right. Yeah, it's a lot better than its station would suggest.
A lot of fruit on the palate and nice and zingy. So and for under $10, you can't go wrong. All right, this next wine that we've got here, Pete. This is one we were tasting last week, but I'm kind of glad it's showed up on our tasting here again this week because it's going to reveal some things that maybe it didn't last week. Now that's the Duperé.
The
Duperé Brut.
This is just our non-vintage Duperé, isn't it? The same one as you said that we tried last week.
Yes, but we tried the Dom Perignon before we tried this.
Very much,
and of course I think the Dom Perignon, as big and rich as that wine is, it kind of covered up some of the subtle characteristics that this wine has into it. And
very much so, yeah. This sort of comes into its own a little bit now. I mean, possibly we did this particular wine a disservice last week as well because we tried it after the Dom Perignon. And as you say, Dom Perignon is the deluxe cuvée of Moët de Chandon. It's their flagship wine. It's always going to be a big, robust wine with masses of intensity and blah, blah, blah. This, on the other hand, is a pretty good drink, but it sort of paled into insignificance almost alongside of the Dom, but maybe unfairly. Had we tried this before the Dom last week, it probably would have looked a little bit better.
There's a lot in this. There's the fruit, and then there's this nutty characteristic that I didn't get last week. So it's absolutely lovely wine. Now, the next wine we've got here, Tate, this is interesting. I put this into our tasting this week as a blind tasting, and we provided some options for our tasting...
our tasting team.
Yes, and it's Tabilk Marsanne 2012.
Okay.
Now, interesting story that I might just throw in here, Pete. The Marsanne grape was nearly obliterated in France about World War II time because it got phylloxera, and of course they pulled it all out to get rid of the root systems. But some of it made it over here through Chateau Tabilk, and so some of these vines at Chateau Tabilk are 150 years old.
Okay.
And they do a fabulous job with this, and it cellars very well.
It does.
Not something you find in all white wines.
No, that's true.
But it cellars very well.
I mean, with as you say, you talk about phylloxera in France. I mean, that was a scourge of the French wine industry in the 19th century, in the late 1800s, and it was similarly a problem in Victoria. That was part of the reason they had to get different grapes, that would perhaps withstand the ravages of phylloxera. But as you say, the Marsanne grapes in Tabilk go back well before World War II, in fact. And another interesting part of that story is that they have made a Marsanne at Tabilk since the 1930s. People think about wines in Australia that have got a long lineage and a proud history. Everybody knows about Penfolds Grange and Henschke Hill of Grace, but not many people realise that Tabilk has been making their Marsanne longer than either of those two wines.
And as a price point on the shelf, it's incredible.
It's somewhat less expensive than Grange and Hill of Grace.
Around that $10 price point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fabulous wine.
The thing about it too, as a potential keeper, is the fact that it's probably got more in common with Semillon, and in particular Hunter Valley Semillon, in that sense that it's an unoaked wine. They don't put any oak in it. It feeds off its acid, and it becomes more complex with bottle age simply because the acid softens and the rest of the fruit characters meld into the wine, and so you have this potential for a rich, toasty sort of a wine when it gets to be about 10 years of age.
And that's one of the characteristics that it gets in a subtle sense in the 2012, that toastiness. But again, it's going to get better as it goes on.
But as a drink now, you could drink that with almost any sort of seafood, any sort of pasta dishes with creamy sauces. It's got a really zesty, vibrant palate and, a really crisp, dry white.
Yeah, lovely wine. That was a great wine for our blind tasting this week. Next wine here is a New Zealand wine, Sauvignon Blanc.
Oh, wow.
Seems
something
like we
different.
get one a week.
Fancy that. A Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc.
Yes.
Who would have thought that anybody would have wanted to put that into a wine tasting?
2012 Toy Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. And the first thing I get on the nose here, Peter, it's, again, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. It's passion fruit. It's the
there's a bit of grassiness there as well.
Yes.
But tropical fruits, really big, up there, very fragrant. Yeah, a bit of gooseberries. I mean, all of those sort of characteristics that make the style so popular.
I don't get the acid, as much acid on here, but it seems to fall away in the middle palate very quickly.
There's a lot of upfront flavour. It doesn't quite have the length that you maybe would expect or hope to find on some of the better examples, but it's an honest enough wine, nothing particularly wrong with it, and chill it down on a hot day, it'd probably work quite well.
Yep.
But that's a style that's pretty ubiquitous, you see it all over the place, and it's very recognisable and the punters love it.
Next one here, we go to the Reds. We've got Peter Lehman, Difficult Vintage, 2011 in Barossa.
Okay.
Now, Shiraz Grenache, I like this particular wine because it seems you get that Shiraz up front, but then the Grenache on the palate tends to come through a little bit with those sort of lollipop characteristics.
Well, the Grenache also kicks in on the nose with the musk stick and the confectionery, the lollipop sort of aromatics that you get, which is where the Grenache makes its presence felt, if you like. Again, bearing in mind, this is the entry-level sort of wine from the Peter Lehman stable, and a wine that's designed as a quaffer, an everyday drinking wine, but with very soft, generous fruit and uncomplicated. There'll be basically no oak in this. Whatever oak is in there will be old oak. The idea is to let the fruit sing, and I think you're getting really quite appealing sweet fruit character, but no overt sugariness, and a really generous, nice, pleasant mouthful of wine.
I'd take that to any barbecue.
Absolutely.
Now, moving right along, we've got Church Block. We're at Church Block, and this is a Cabernet, Shiraz, and a Merlot.
This is an all-sorts blend.
2011. Now, 2011 McLaren Vale, I understand that wasn't such a bad year in Australia.
Well, it wasn't such a bad year for McLaren Vale.
Yes.
It was a difficult, cool, wet vintage across basically most of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and the warmer parts of South Australia, or the premium regions, Langhorne Creek, Barossa Valley, most of them suffered, but McLaren Vale, for one reason or another, did not suffer as much, according to the winemakers. The trade tasting I went to a couple of weeks ago, the fellow from Wirrawira was there, and he said, they didn't do quite as well as maybe they would have hoped, and certainly not as well as they did in 2010 as far as their premium wines are concerned, but 11 was not a write-off for McLaren Vale.
I get just reading the back label here, we've got Cabernet 47%, Shiraz is 44%, Merlot at 9%. And I get a real fruity nose on this wine, and then on the palate, it just backs it up. It's huge fruit on the palate, and quite a long palate, and I think towards the end of that, you get that Merlot characteristics, the plums.
Well, the Merlot works well in that context because, you're getting the middle palate softness from the Merlot. It's a bit of a cliche sometimes, but it does come true with this wine. The other thing with a wine like the Church Block is that the little components will vary from one vintage to the next according to the characters of the vintage and what the winemakers want from the wine. They want to make something that's relatively consistent, if they can do it, from one vintage to the next, because this is their go-to wine, and this is their bread and breakfast. This is what they want people to know, and so they will tweak that There might be some more Cabernet in one vintage, less in another vintage, depending on how they want the end result to look. But that's a pretty smart wine and a good example of what the church block style is all about.
Yeah, another one I wouldn't be ashamed to take to any barbecue. Next wine that we've got here, Pete, again, we put this into a bit of a blind tasting this week, just to see if people could pick out some of the characteristics. We tried the 2009 vintage of this wine, Lake Breeze, Langhorne Creek.
Month or two ago.
Yeah, the Benuta.
Yep.
And this is the 2010 Shiraz Cabernet. Now, I don't get quite the eucalypt characteristics of Langhorne Creek as I did
in the
2009, but they're definitely there. I get them on the nose very subtly, and I get them on the palate as well.
Well, it's an interesting thing because we've looked at that and said previously that you do get a eucalypt character across a lot of the wine that comes out of Langhorne Creek. But some makers, if you like, tend to have a more pronounced character of eucalypt in their wine, and Lake Breeze is one of those that they seem to get more of it than maybe one or two of the other makers. But it's an endearing character. It's something that's part of their wine, and it's part of this wine. And I think it's something that the punters like. It's also something the show judges like, because this Benuta habitually wins gold medals. And it's a very interesting thing to look at this particular style of wine, the Lake Breeze Benuta. Over the years, it's been a bit of a favourite on the show circuit, and it's a favourite with the punters as well. And you can see why a wine of this ilk, a wine like this, stylistically would stand out in a lineup. Why the judges, looking for red blends and maybe a lineup with 20 or 30 different wines, that a wine like this might jump out at them and say, hey, that's a really quite appealing character. And I think, in greater or lesser degree, it does that in almost all the vintages of this wine. So 2010 is a great vintage, and I wouldn't be surprised if that eucalypt character, if you like, manifests itself even more prominently, in a couple of years' time.
I'll just expand on that a little bit too, Pete. I learned something from a winemaker just this week. That eucalypt characteristic that you get from those Langhorne Creek wines, that comes from the eucalypt that is in the air, and of course it settles onto the grapes, and that's why they get that characteristic.
And it makes sense. I've experienced that in other wines from other regions as well, and it makes sense that it would be there. I mean, eucalypt is such a pervasive character; it's so dominant. A little bit like having a bit of rosemary in your cooking. It's you only need a little bit and it goes a long way. Well, absolutely. Eucalypt is a bit like that.
All right, the last wine we've got here, Pete, this week is the Penfolds Bin 128. Now, the Bin 128, of course, is the Shiraz, and that's Coonawarra Shiraz, 2008.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting wine, this, the 128. It's always an interesting wine, the Penny's Bin series wines. Amongst the reds, it's an unusual wine in the Bin series in that it does come from a single region. It's all Coonawarra fruit. A lot of the others are multi-regional. Even when you go up in price, you look at the 389, you look at the 407, you look at the St Henri, these wines are all multi-regional wines. Penfolds Grange, their flagship wine, is multi-regional, whereas the 128 is all Shiraz and it's all from Coonawarra. So that makes it a bit of a special wine.
Yep, lovely, lovely wine. There's a lot happening on the palate here, on the nose. You're getting the big fruit, and it seems to be really well balanced. There's a big fruit, but then there's good tannin in there as well, and it just lingers on the palate. That's great wine.
There's a lot going on there. A lot of Chari oak as well, which is a bit of it's Penfolds oak in a sense rather than just oak. It's a style that you learn to recognise as a Penfolds red wine style,
and it's toastiness in that.
Absolutely, and it tends to transcend the different regions and the different grapes. It's almost like there's a Penfolds house style, and you get that in a lot of those wines. Fruit sweetness, oak sweetness, but really well balanced, and good lingering flavours as well.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Pete.
No problem.
We'll see you again next week.
We will.
On OzwineTv.